Welcome back to Senior Choices. I'm your host, Brent Veasey, and we're talking about our debt, the federal debt. And we were talking about the Treasury bills and how the market is now basically determined that our future is going to be 3 to 4% inflation and 5 to 6% interest rates. And that's what's being reflected in our yields on the interest rates for Treasury bonds that are continuing to go up because nobody wants to buy the lower interest rate when we're going to have more of these higher interest rates come about, and then their investments can become useless, okay, and worthless, or worth less than what they paid for it, is what I should say, okay? But the bottom line here is that we've had this conversation on the deficit and everything, and then the actual debt. And someone asked me the other day, it's like, okay, so when companies, big companies, okay, are borrowing money, they often sometimes borrow it internally first, meaning that if another department has a surplus and they aren't going to be able to use the money, then they can offer it to another department and it gets transferred in an interdepartmental transfer, however you want to, and the money goes back and forth, okay? So within a company, it happens all the time, and it shows up as debits and credits on balance sheets, and accountants are loving it and going, yay, I have a job because this is what we're doing, and we need to keep track of all this, and it's all good. Okay, but the bottom line is all of this is being handled internally amongst themselves. Okay, and companies are finding ways of doing that first before they go outside and get an external loan or do stocks or whatever else. So then somebody asked me this question. They said, you know, we have this huge federal debt. Who do we owe the money to? Do we owe it to ourselves? You know, that's a very good question. And the reality of that question is this, that well over 60%, probably in some instances close to 2/3 of the total debt that we owe is to domestic or internal to our borders sources. That's interesting, isn't it? If we have $31 trillion of debt and we have basically $20 trillion owed to us, meaning me, because I have a Treasury bill at home that's accumulating interest in Treasury, or you, okay, so you're doing this as well, or this fund, or this retirement account, or this company, the city, the state. How about this? The Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve currently, right now, has $7 trillion of Treasury bills as assets. It's the largest source of ownership of our Treasury bills. $7 trillion. That's enormous, isn't it? Okay? And now they are quietly starting to sell those assets. They're divesting themselves of them. Okay? Because they don't want to be in the business of buying the debt all the time, but a lot of the debt they accumulated during the pandemic in order to keep markets open because nobody was doing anything. So markets were close to closing down because they didn't have any of the liquidity, money, cash, literally, going into them. So the Fed's like, okay, so we're going to step in and we're going to buy some of the Treasury bills to keep the markets going and liquid. And they did. And they bought several trillion dollars, a few $1 trillion of those Treasury bills and added it to their asset holdings. But if we owe $7 trillion back to the Fed, of those, and now they're selling them or divesting themselves of them, and they're selling it to other Americans and stuff and other. The bottom line here is, here's the question. If we owe the money to ourselves, is it truly debt? So I asked an accounting person about this, a true expert in accounting, my wife, and she actually, because she does this as her job, as an accountant person, and I said, so strictly from an accounting perspective, is this a debt? And she's like, well, yeah, because it comes up on the ledger as a negative balance. So that's debt. So that's not good per se. I was like, okay, but in reality, if you owe it to yourself and all you're doing is transferring it from one account over here, my bank account, over into Uncle Sam's bank account over here, and we are kind of one and the same because we're a democracy and we the people, we're the government and everything else, all that jazz. So if it's all basically our money and we're just transferring it back and forth and we're literally having the government invest it at one level by government spending and then we're resupporting that with more investment in government bonds, then is it really debt? Isn't it more like a transfer payment? Okay? Allocating money from one area into another area. That's an interesting question, isn't it? Because what happens if we have to decide that all the debt has to get repaid like that, instantly? Well, then we're going to have about $20 trillion of money coming back into our economy because the money is going to get paid to our citizens, our companies, organizations, entities, retirement funds, states, cities, all of those. $20 trillion re-injected into the economy. So then that's bad? Is it? I mean, that's the question. I mean, granted, we owe several trillion dollars to outside entities, foreign. Okay? We do. Okay? We owe several trillion to Japan and China. We owe several trillion to the British. Okay? And I'm sure we owe $1 trillion or so, or several hundred billion to other various foreign companies or foreign other entities. So that's not necessarily good. But if it's owed to ourselves, is that all bad? And I think that's the ultimate question we've got to ask ourselves. Because we do owe most of it to ourselves. Interesting, isn't it? When we come back after the station break, we're going to talk a little bit more about this and then dive back into something we've talked about regarding inflation here on Senior Choices. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Senior Choices. I'm your host, Brent Veasey, and we've just finished off asking the question, if we owe ourselves the money, is our federal debt really debt? Because if it turns out that if we have to repay it directly, immediately, then of the $31 trillion, 18 to 20 trillion of that dollars is going to come right back into this country and into our hands as taxpayers, bondholders, and other entities. And that's going to be that much money re-injected into our economy for various reasons. So then, is that bad? That's an interesting question. It really is. Another interesting question that for sure is on all of our mind is what's going to go on with inflation. Now, they've had some latest numbers come out, and in the latest numbers, the producer price index, this is the amount of money that producers, the people that make stuff, are paying for the inputs that go into making the stuff that we want on a regular basis, okay? And last month in September, the producer price index year over year, okay, was 2.5% increase, which is below the 3% threshold that the Fed wants, okay? So that's good. Now, the not so good part is that month over month, from August to September, the producer price index went up 0.5%, 0.6%. That over a full year, if that happens every month, would be 6% increase, which is not good. Okay. And most all of that 0.6% was again in two areas, and that's fuel and again, housing. Okay. Those issues. Again. Now, we've had some things happen to address the fuel because the price of oil has come down from the mid 90s down into the mid to upper 80s for the most part. And what's happening in that is that, and we had the conversation regarding demand and demand being down, especially from China. Those trends are still kind of there. Okay? And still happening. Now, recently, you've had some fluctuations in the price of oil because of what's going on in the Middle East. And what's going on in the Middle East is the Hamas and Israel war. Okay, well, Brent, Israel's not an oil producer, and Hamas sure is not an oil producer. So why is this impacting the price of oil? Well, because the Middle East is a source of a large percentage of our oil supply for the entire world. Not the United States, but the world. Okay? And a lot of the oil goes through a little area of land called the Strait of Hormuz. Okay? It's a strait. Basically, it's like a 40-mile wide open area of water between Iran and the Arabian Peninsula. And a lot of the Middle East's oil from Iraq, from the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, a lot of their oil is on ships that have to pass through that 40-mile wide stretch of water. Okay? And that 40-mile wide stretch of water is so narrow that the Iranian Navy likes to sometimes stick their boats there and mess with the ships that are coming through. Mess with in not a good way. Okay? So they are potentially threatening to do that again because Hamas is something that they support financially. And that's one of the reasons why the price of oil has kind of gone up, because there's concern that Iran may become more involved in this war itself. They may have more of their friends get involved with the war as well in the whole geographic area of the Middle East. And there's just a lot of negativity on that side of things right now, a lot of unknown. And that's why the price of oil is kind of wobbling, fluctuating on a daily basis, depending on what's going on in the news in the Israel area. So, if the price of oil can ever get stabilized and under control, And if we can have some stabilization in the pricing of housing in this country, and if we can have no more severe weather disruptions on the supply of food, crops, and various things, then we may actually have some possibility of getting inflation under control. How about that? So, no more weather disruptions, no more of the war thing going on, and then having the price of oil stabilize for a variety of things, and we're going to be all good, right? Well, I think the markets have already kind of given us the preview of where they think that's actually going to be, because as we discussed earlier in the show, the 30-year Treasury bond yield is already at its highest levels ever. In a while. I shouldn't say ever. It's been higher, but they've been up into a level that they haven't been at in a couple of decades. Because the expectation is that the pricing is going to stabilize somewhere in the ballpark of 3 to 4% for inflation, which is historically where a market economy is supposed to be at, folks. That's the important thing in all of this. The market is saying that we're going to be back to where we should be as a free market economy in a democracy. 3 to 4% inflation. 2% is an actual mirage. That's not supposed to be happening. Okay? That's not supposed to be happening. Because at 2% inflation, you're not getting enough growth to be able to keep an economy going as a positive engine for employment. That's what happens. That's why it does happen. So that's where we are. And we're going to be in this new reality. And it's a reality that some of us have already been through. Okay? You baby boomers out there, y'all have been through this. Y'all know what this is going to be like. Gen Xers like me, we have a sense of it because we were kids when stuff like this was going on. So maybe not a full sense, but we have seen it too and know what it's like. So everybody else, y'all got to get on board with this. This is where we are. Well, I think we might have another segment in us. And when we come back after this station break, we're going to talk about that and more here on Senior Choices. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Senior Choices. I'm Brent Veasey, your host, and we're just going to be kind of wrapping things up. Keep your eyes on Washington. It's going to be crazy. Hopefully they're going to be able to figure out that they need to work together and make some things happen for us. That's positive. Okay? So that's good. It's also going to be good for us to keep an eye on what's going on regarding our debt and deficits. Let's get our taxes collected. Guys, if you haven't paid your taxes, pay your taxes. Okay? Pay your taxes. Because we need that for investing for our country. Okay? But it's also important to know that the bond market's already had its kind of review of us and said, hey, this is where we are. 3 to 4% inflation, 5 to 6% interest rates. That's what the bond market is saying. So keep that in mind. And if we owe the debt to ourselves, is it really debt? That is a very good question. And we need to really think about that moving forward. Okay? Deficit spending is not good just for the sake of it, but okay, we need to get that under control for the sake of it. But the debt itself that everybody focuses on, we got to think about that. Okay? And we just have to be knowing that inflation is going to be wobbly until things figure itself out. So, as always, remember to live your best life. And it's living your best life with Senior Choices. Thank you very much for your attention this week. I hope to see y'all again next week here on Radio KAIR. Stay tuned, and thank you very much. Talk to y'all again. Goodbye.